It was a cool, damp evening in the late autumn of 2022, when a young man named Kevin decided to pack his bags and make a long, familiar drive. Kevin was living in Oakland at the time, working a demanding job in the bustling Bay Area, and he had spent the weekend visiting his parents up in the quiet coastal city of Eureka. If you have ever driven Highway 101 along the rugged Northern California coast, you know that it is a beautiful, scenic journey during the daytime. You have the towering redwoods on one side and the vast, crashing Pacific Ocean on the other. But once the sun goes down, that same highway transforms into a completely different environment. It becomes a dark, winding, and incredibly ominous stretch of road. There are no streetlights for miles. Cell phone reception is virtually non-existent, and you can easily go 30 or 40 minutes without seeing another pair of headlights. Kevin knew this drive well, but on this particular Sunday, he made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He decided to leave his parents' house around 8 o'clock in the evening. In hindsight, he realized it was a foolish move. He should have just stayed the night, slept in a comfortable bed, and driven back early on Monday morning. But he had an early morning shift waiting for him in Oakland, and he figured he would rather just push through the night and get the drive over with. It is a classic mistake, the kind of compromise we make with ourselves all the time, thinking we can handle the fatigue. The first couple of hours of the drive went smoothly. The highway was empty, and Kevin was making good time. But as he continued south, the road narrowed down from a multi-lane highway into a tight 2-lane strip of asphalt. This is how most of rural Highway 101 is once you get far enough north of the San Francisco Bay Area. It is just one lane in each direction, carved directly through the dense, ancient forests. It was somewhere around the small coastal town of Trinidad when the weather suddenly took a turn. The fog started rolling in from the ocean. Now, fog along the Northern California coast is incredibly common, and Kevin was used to driving in it. But as he watched the gray mist creep over his hood, he realized this was not normal fog. Within a span of barely 5 minutes, the visibility collapsed. It went from a clear night to an absolute wall of white. Kevin could barely see 20 feet ahead of his bumper. At this point, he was forced to slow his car down to about 35 miles per hour. The smart, logical thing to do would have been to pull off the road and wait for the fog to clear. But the problem was, there are almost no safe places to stop along that section of Highway 101. The shoulders are incredibly narrow, often bordered by steep drops or massive tree trunks. Kevin felt that stopping on the side of the road in zero visibility conditions was actually more dangerous than continuing to drive, because another tired driver could easily plow into the back of his stationary car. So he decided to keep going, taking it as slow as possible, desperately hoping the fog would break. But thick fog does something strange to your brain. Any driver who has experienced it knows that it completely destroys your sense of spatial awareness. You cannot see any landmarks. You cannot tell how fast you are actually moving, and you lose all concept of distance. The white mist reflects your own headlights back at you, creating a disorienting, hypnotic effect that makes you feel like you are floating in an empty void. Kevin was already exhausted from a long weekend, and the intense strain of staring into the white darkness was starting to wear him down. He had been driving through this blinding mist for about 30 minutes, when his headlights caught something unexpected up ahead. Off to the right side of the road, on the narrow gravel shoulder, there was a figure. At first, Kevin thought it was just a strange shadow or a signpost, but as he crept closer, the shape resolved into a human being. It was a tall man, wearing dark clothing, standing perfectly still on the shoulder, facing directly toward the road. The man was not walking. He was not waving his arms to signal for help, and he did not have a phone in his hands. He was just standing there, completely rigid, staring straight ahead into the empty space where the road met the forest. Kevin slowed his car down even more as he approached. He was terrified that the man might suddenly step out into the path of his vehicle, or that he might clip him with his side mirror. But as Kevin rolled slowly past, the man did not flinch. He did not turn his head, and he did not track the car with his eyes. He remained completely motionless, like a statue. Kevin got a clear look at his face through the passenger window, and there was nothing overtly terrifying about his features. He looked like an ordinary guy. Kevin tried to rationalize it. He figured the man's car had probably broken down nearby, and he was simply waiting for a tow truck or a friend to pick him up. That made logical sense. But as Kevin kept driving, he realized there was a major flaw in that theory. He had not passed any other vehicles on the shoulder. There was no broken down car anywhere in sight. There was absolutely no reason for a person to be standing in that exact spot, in the middle of a freezing, blinding fog, miles away from any town. Kevin felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He briefly thought about turning around to ask if the man needed assistance, but an overwhelming gut instinct told him to keep going. Something about the entire scene felt completely wrong, and he decided it was best not to get involved. But then, about 10 minutes later, the nightmare truly began. Kevin was still crawling through the dense fog, keeping his eyes glued to the center line of the road, when his headlights illuminated another figure on the shoulder. He tapped his brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. It was the exact same man. There was absolutely no doubt about it. It was the same height, the same build, the same dark clothing, and the exact same rigid, unnatural stance. The only difference was that this time, the figure was standing on the left side of the road instead of the right. Kevin actually spoke out loud to himself in the empty car, asking what the hell was going on. It was physically impossible. Kevin was the only car on this stretch of highway. He had not been passed by anyone, and there were no side streets, shortcuts, or dirt roads that would allow a pedestrian to overtake a motorized vehicle, even one traveling at 35 miles per hour. The redwood forest on either side of the highway was dense, choked with thick undergrowth and fallen logs, making it impossible for someone to run through the trees and get ahead of him. The only logical explanation was that this was a completely different person who just happened to look identical and was standing in the exact same creepy way. But Kevin needed to be sure. As his car drew parallel to the figure, he forced himself to look, and that was when his heart nearly stopped. It was the same man. But this time, the man did not remain stationary. As Kevin's car passed, the man's head suddenly snapped toward the driver's side window. His eyes locked directly onto Kevin S. The movement was so fast, so sudden, that it felt completely unnatural. Kevin gasped, turning his gaze back to the road and stepping on the gas pedal. He instantly regretted making eye contact. The sheer malice and emptiness in that split-second gaze sent a wave of pure terror through his body. He accelerated to 45 miles per hour, pushing his car through the thick fog, desperately wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was waiting on the highway. But the fog was getting even worse. The white mist seemed to thicken by the second, swallowing the road ahead. Kevin could no longer see the yellow center line, and he realized that if he kept driving at this speed, he was going to drift off the asphalt and crash into a redwood tree. He had no choice but to ease off the accelerator and slow back down to a crawl. His mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Was he losing his mind? Was the extreme fatigue causing him to experience vivid, waking hallucinations? He tried to convince himself that his tired brain was just playing tricks on him, projecting his fears onto the shadows of the fog. But his thoughts were abruptly cut off when his headlights exposed a third obstacle. Just 3 minutes after the second encounter, a figure appeared directly in the middle of his lane. This time, the person was standing right in the path of the car, completely blocking the lane. He was wearing a dark hood that was pulled low, obscuring his face entirely. Kevin slammed his foot onto the brake pedal, bringing the car to a screeching halt just yards away from the figure. The figure did not move. He did not jump out of the way, and he did not show any reaction to the headlights shining directly on him. Kevin was frozen with fear. He was trapped in his car, staring at a hooded figure, in the middle of a desolate highway in the dead of night. In a panic, Kevin flashed his high beams, hoping the bright light would startle the person into moving. But there was no response. The hooded figure just stood there, and even though Kevin could not see his eyes beneath the hood, he could feel a heavy, suffocating gaze boring through his windshield. Desperate to escape, Kevin shifted the car into reverse. He looked over his shoulder at his rearview mirror, intending to back up and turn around. But what he saw in the mirror made him scream aloud. Another person had emerged from the fog behind his car. This figure was creeping silently toward his rear bumper, closing the distance rapidly. Kevin was boxed in. There was a person blocking the road ahead, and another closing in from behind. In that moment, the theory of a harmless hallucination evaporated. Kevin knew he was facing a very real, highly coordinated threat on his life. He threw the car back into drive. He had no time to think. He gripped the steering wheel, pulled hard to the right, and crossed over into the opposite lane of the empty highway, accelerating rapidly to swerve around the hooded figure in front of him. The figure in the road did not even attempt to step in front of the swerving car. Kevin thought he had successfully escaped, but just as he pulled back into his lane and accelerated, a violent impact rattled his entire vehicle. It was not a minor bump. It was a massive, crushing blow that hit the rear end of his car. The force of the impact was so great that the back end of the vehicle jolted violently to the right, and the agonizing sound of grinding metal and breaking plastic echoed through the cabin. Kevin fought to maintain control of the steering wheel, his tires screaming against the damp asphalt. He assumed that another vehicle, perhaps one driving without lights in the fog, had slammed into him from behind. He looked in his rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or the silhouette of a pursuing car. But there was absolutely nothing. The space behind his car was completely empty. There were no headlights, no cars, and no sign of the people who had just boxed him in. The road was enveloped in a silent, static fog, as if nothing had ever happened. The sheer impossibility of the situation made the terror even more unbearable. Kevin did not stop to investigate. He pressed his foot flat against the accelerator, driving as fast as he dared through the heavy mist, his heart hammering against his ribs. By the time he finally reached the interchange for the main highway, the fog began to thin out, and the familiar lights of civilization came into view. For the first time in hours, Kevin felt the icy grip of panic begin to loosen. His brain, desperate for comfort, immediately began to rationalize the entire ordeal. He told himself that he had simply suffered a massive, sleep-deprived hallucination. He had been driving for nearly 4 hours, staring into a blinding white void, entirely alone. It was a well-documented phenomenon that extreme sensory deprivation and exhaustion could cause the brain to project incredibly vivid, lifelike illusions. He convinced himself that the figures, the trap, and even the sensation of the crash were all just a waking nightmare. He decided he would go home, sleep for 12 hours, and forget the entire night ever happened. But when Kevin finally pulled into his driveway and stepped out of his car, he decided to walk around to the back of the vehicle. He stopped dead in his tracks. The rear bumper of his car was completely destroyed. A massive, deep dent ran across almost the entire width of the metal and plastic, pushed inward with incredible force. The damage was extensive, far worse than he had imagined during the drive. Kevin stared at the ruined bumper for 5 minutes in total silence. He reached out and touched the bent metal. It was cold and real. But as he inspected the damage closer, he noticed something highly unusual. There was absolutely no paint transfer on the bumper. If another car had struck him, there would have been traces of the other vehicle's paint left behind in the scratch marks. Instead, there was only bare, scraped metal and torn plastic. This meant that whatever had hit his car was not a standard vehicle. But if it was not a car, what could have possibly caused such a violent, destructive impact? The reality of the situation washed over him. He had not hallucinated. The trap was real. The people in the fog were real. And they had actively tried to stop his car. Kevin ended up calling the local police to report the incident. He gave them the exact location near Trinidad, described the figures, and showed them the physical damage to his bumper. The officers took his statement, but they seemed deeply skeptical. They searched the stretch of highway the following day, but they found no evidence of an accident, no debris, and no signs of anyone lurking in the woods. They suggested that Kevin might have panicked in the fog and backed into a heavy wooden guardrail post or a concrete mile marker, and that his mind, clouded by fatigue, had invented the rest of the story. But Kevin knew the truth. Over the past 4 years, he has replayed that night in his mind thousands of times. He has tried to accept the police explanation, but the sequence of events simply does not align. He knows that he felt the impact while his car was moving forward, accelerating away from the hooded figure. The physical damage was real, and the terrifying realization that someone or something was waiting for him in the Trinidad fog is a shadow that he has never been able to shake. This brings us to the second incident, which occurred just a few miles north during a recent spring break. Marcus, a young college senior, had traveled back to his quiet suburban hometown to spend the week off from classes. While many of his peers were traveling to sunny beaches or busy cities, Marcus chose to return to his roots, looking forward to a week of peace and relaxation. But the problem with returning to a small, suburban town is that there is often absolutely nothing to do. Marcus' hometown was one of those places that was technically close to a major city, but lacked any of the cultural benefits. There were no local bars, no nightlife, and no entertainment options within walking distance. To make matters worse, none of his high school friends shared his spring break schedule. Some had already finished their breaks weeks earlier, while others were still locked in their classrooms. Marcus was facing a week of complete isolation. At the same time, Marcus was attempting to make some positive lifestyle changes. He had decided to cut back on his consumption of nicotine and alcohol, and he knew that sitting around an empty house with nothing to do would only tempt him to slip back into his old habits. To keep his mind occupied and his body busy, he designed a strict daily routine. He resolved to work out every single morning and go for a long, intense run every afternoon. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Marcus laced up his running shoes and stepped out of his front door. He decided to run a specific 3-mile loop that he had completed hundreds of times during his high school cross-country days. The route was deeply familiar to him. It began at his driveway, wound through his quiet neighborhood for about a quarter of a mile, and then cut directly into a wooded trail. This trail traveled through a small isolated patch of forest before emerging back onto the pavement just a block away from his house. Marcus loved the wooded portion of the run. Running on concrete and asphalt was brutal on his knees, but the dirt path through the trees was soft and forgiving. More than that, the forest was always incredibly quiet, offering a peaceful sanctuary where he could clear his head and escape his thoughts. He set out around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was not scheduled to set for another 2 hours, so he had no concerns about daylight. But as soon as he crossed his threshold, he noticed that the weather was incredibly unusual. A thick, heavy fog had settled over the entire town. It was a dense, motionless mist that Marcus had never seen before in all his years of living there. It looked almost artificial, like a digital effect in a video game, or a scene from a low-fidelity animation. The fog was so thick that everything beyond 30 feet simply dissolved into a blank, gray haze. Marcus hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should call off the run. But he quickly dismissed the thought. The trail through the woods was a single straight path with no forks, branches, or confusing intersections. He knew every twist, every turn, and every tree along the route. It was physically impossible to get lost. He pressed the start button on his Garmin GPS watch, took a deep breath, and set off into the gray mist. As he entered the forest, the fog seemed to grow even denser. The thick canopy of the trees blocked out what little daylight remained, creating a dim, twilight atmosphere beneath the branches. Marcus could barely see 15 feet ahead of him, but his feet moved automatically, guiding him along the familiar dirt path. For the first mile and a half, the run was completely normal. He was pacing himself slightly slower than usual due to the limited visibility, but he felt strong and focused. He checked his watch at the 1-mile mark, and then again at the 1.5-mile mark, noting that his time was consistent. But as he approached the 2.5-mile mark, Marcus began to sense that something was wrong. At this point in the loop, the trail was supposed to curve gently to the left, ascend a small, familiar hill, and then exit the woods onto his neighborhood street. He knew this transition by heart. But as he looked down at his watch and saw that he had covered 2.5 miles, he realized he was still deep within the forest. There was no curve, no hill, and no sign of the neighborhood. The path just continued straight ahead, swallowed by the thick fog. Marcus tried to remain calm. He figured that his GPS watch was simply malfunctioning. It was an older model, and it was highly likely that the dense tree cover and the heavy fog were interfering with the satellite signal, causing the watch to overestimate his distance. He convinced himself that he simply had not run as far as the watch claimed, and he decided to keep moving forward. But then, the watch ticked over to 3 miles. 3 miles was the entire length of the loop. By this point, Marcus should have been standing in his own driveway. Instead, he was still surrounded by a dense wall of trees, running along a dirt path that seemed to stretch on endlessly into the white void. Marcus came to a sudden halt. His heart was pounding, and it was not just from the physical exertion. He stood in the middle of the trail, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. There was only one path through these woods. He had not stepped off the trail, and he had not taken any wrong turns because there were no other turns to take. How was it possible that he was still in the forest? He looked down at his wrist. The distance on his watch read 3.1 miles, but then, as he stood completely still, he watched the numbers continue to climb. 3.2 miles, 3.3 miles. The GPS was clearly malfunctioning, spinning out of control. This confirmed his theory that the technology was failing, but it did not explain why he had not reached the end of the trail. Faced with no other choice, Marcus decided to turn around and retrace his steps. If he ran back the way he came, he would eventually reach the entrance where he had started, and from there he could easily walk back to his house. He turned on his heel and began to run in the opposite direction. But as soon as he turned, the atmosphere in the woods shifted. The fog grew even thicker, wrapping around him like a cold, wet blanket. He had to slow his pace significantly to ensure he did not trip over exposed roots or wander off the edge of the dirt path. He had been running back for about a mile when he heard it. It was a sound. These woods were typically dead silent. They were too small to support any large wildlife, and Marcus had never heard anything louder than the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the dry leaves. But this sound was entirely different. It was unlike anything he had ever heard in his life. It was a low, vibrating drone. The closest he could get to describing it was a human moan. But it was far deeper, heavier, and completely devoid of emotion. It was a sustained, wavering noise that fluctuated in pitch, rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern, almost like an air raid siren. But there was an unmistakable human quality to the tone, as if it were being produced by a massive set of lungs. Marcus felt a wave of primal fear wash over him. The sound did not originate from a single point. It seemed to echo off the trees surrounding him from all directions. It was not a call for help, and it did not sound like an animal in distress. It was a cold, calculated noise that seemed to have no other purpose than to terrify him. He started to run faster. But Marcus was already exhausted. He had been running for over 4 miles at this point, and his legs felt like lead. The fear was draining his remaining energy, forcing him to gasp for air as he pushed his body to its absolute limits. But no matter how fast he ran, the sound kept pace with him. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw nothing but the dense white wall of fog. But the low, droning hum remained right behind him, matching his strides, rising and falling with an agonizing consistency. It felt as though whatever was making the noise was floating just inches beyond his field of vision, waiting for him to collapse from exhaustion. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the trees began to thin. Marcus burst out of the forest, stumbling onto the familiar asphalt of his neighborhood street. He collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he fought back the urge to vomit. The fog was still incredibly thick, even outside the cover of the trees. Marcus forced himself to turn around and look back at the trailhead. And there, standing in the middle of the dirt path, just a few feet inside the forest line, was a figure. It was a massive, dark silhouette completely enveloped in the fog. It was far taller than any normal human being. Marcus was over 6 feet tall, and he estimated that this figure stood at least 7 feet high. It was a solid, black mass that did not appear to have any distinct clothing or features. The figure did not move toward him, and it did not retreat back into the forest. It just stood there, swaying gently from side to side, like a tree branch moving in a breeze that Marcus could not feel. The low, droning noise had finally stopped, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. Marcus did not wait to see what the figure would do. He scrambled to his feet. turned away from the woods, and ran the final block to his house without ever looking back. He told his parents what had happened. They listened patiently, but they quickly offered a rational explanation. They suggested that some local teenager, knowing Marcus' running schedule, had decided to play an elaborate, cruel prank on him. They argued that a tall person, perhaps wearing a dark coat, could have hidden in the woods and used a portable speaker or a megaphone to project the strange droning sound, keeping pace with him along the edge of the trail. But Marcus knew that explanation was physically impossible. No human being could run through the dense, choked undergrowth of those woods, matching the pace of an experienced cross-country runner, while simultaneously maintaining a flawless, breath-control heavy vocal drone, and the sheer height of the figure was something he could not ignore. To this day, Marcus is back at college, but the memory of that afternoon continues to haunt him. He cannot shake the image of that massive, swaying silhouette waiting for him at the edge of the trees, and he has never set foot in those woods again. The final, and perhaps most disturbing, incident occurred several years earlier, along the cold, misty waters of Willapa Bay in Washington State. Two close friends, Edwin and Liam, had been planning a kayaking trip to the bay for over 2 years, and they had finally managed to coordinate their schedules for a late September weekend. Both men were highly experienced outdoorsmen. They had been kayaking since they were children, and Edwin had actually spent several summers working as a professional kayak guide during his college years. They were not amateurs who could be easily disoriented by a change in weather, and they were well equipped with GPS devices, emergency beacons, compasses, and survival gear. Willapa Bay is a massive tidal estuary, stretching 25 miles along the Washington coast. It is a wild, remote place, dominated by commercial oyster farms, sandbars, and the mudflats of a national wildlife refuge. On a clear day, it is a serene and peaceful environment, but when the coastal weather turns, it can become a treacherous trap. They launched their kayaks early on a Saturday morning from a public access point near Nakota. The fog was incredibly thick, settling over the water like a heavy blanket. But Edwin and Liam were not concerned. They knew that coastal fog was standard for late September, and they expected the morning sun to burn it off by midday. They set their GPS coordinates for Long Island, planning to spend the morning bird watching, have lunch on an isolated sandbar, and return before the afternoon tide shifted. As they paddled out into the bay, the fog enveloped them. It created a strange sensory deprivation chamber, muffling all sound, and reducing their visibility to about 40 feet in any direction. They paddled close together, keeping their eyes on each other's kayaks, and checking their compass bearings every few minutes to ensure they stayed on course. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Liam heard a sound. It was a splashing noise, coming from somewhere off to their right. At first, Liam assumed it was just Edwin adjusting his stroke or clearing water from his deck, but when he looked over, he saw that Edwin had stopped paddling entirely. His paddle was resting across his lap, and he was staring intently into the fog. Edwin asked if Liam had heard the noise, and Liam nodded. They both sat perfectly still, letting their kayaks drift on the calm water, listening to the silence. The sound returned. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic pulling of oars. Liam knew the difference between the sound of a kayak paddle and the sound of a rowboat's oars. A paddle makes a soft slicing sound as it enters the water, while an oar produces a heavy, hollow splash, followed by the metallic creak of the oarlock. This was definitely a rowboat, and it sounded close, perhaps 100 feet away, hidden somewhere in the thick white mist. Edwin suggested that it was likely another boater out on the bay, perhaps a local fisherman checking crab pots, or another kayaker exploring the estuary. It was a reasonable assumption, but standard safety protocol in low visibility conditions is to call out to announce your position, preventing an accidental collision. Edwin cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted a friendly greeting into the fog. There was no response. The rowing sound did not pause. It did not slow down, and it did not speed up. The steady, hypnotic rhythm of the oars simply continued. Completely ignoring Edwin's call, the two friends began to paddle again, assuming they would eventually pass the other vessel, or that the rower would move away. But as they paddled, they realized something incredibly unsettling. No matter how fast or slow they paddled, and no matter which direction they turned, the sound of the rowing remained at the exact same distance. It stayed locked onto their right flank, about 100 feet away, perfectly matching their speed. The constant, unvarying rhythm of the oars began to feel incredibly oppressive. It was a mechanical, tireless pace that seemed humanly impossible to maintain without a single pause or variation. As the minutes dragged on, the silence between Edwin and Liam grew heavy with tension. At one point, they shifted their course slightly to the east, hoping to edge closer to the shoreline. As they turned, a sudden brief clearing in the fog appeared. For a fraction of a second, the mist parted, revealing a small wooden rowboat floating in the water. Liam saw it clearly. The wood of the boat was weathered and dark, almost black. Inside, he could see the distinct silhouette of a person sitting at the oars, their back turned to the kayakers, pulling with a slow, steady stroke. But before Liam could call out, the fog closed back in, swallowing the boat once again. The entire glimpse had lasted no more than 3 seconds. Liam asked Edwin if he had seen it, and Edwin confirmed that he had. At that moment, any desire to continue their trip evaporated. The silent, relentless presence of the rowboat had crossed the line from unusual to deeply threatening. They did not know who was in that boat, or why they were following them through the blinding fog without acknowledging their presence. They decided to abort the trip and head straight for the shore. But navigating Willapa Bay in a thick fog is an incredibly difficult task. The estuary is filled with shifting sandbars, shallow mudflats, and deep channels that can change with the tides. If they made a wrong turn, they could easily ground their kayaks on a mud flat, leaving them stranded in the open water, while the mysterious rowboat lurked nearby. They paddled southeast, putting all their strength into their strokes. The heavy, rhythmic splashing of the oars followed them, never losing ground, a constant shadow in the white mist. And then, without warning, the fog began to lift. It did not disappear entirely, but it thinned significantly, extending their visibility to about 100 yards. Liam immediately whipped his head to the right, searching the water where the rowing sound had been coming from just seconds earlier. There was nothing there. The water was completely flat and empty. He spun around, scanning the bay in every direction. There were no boats, no ripples, and no signs of any other vessels. The rowing sound had stopped entirely. He looked at Edwin, and he could see the absolute terror in his friend's eyes. The physical impossibility of a heavy wooden rowboat simply vanishing from open water in a matter of seconds was too much to comprehend. They paddled with frantic energy toward the shoreline, which had finally come into view. They did not look for a proper landing spot. They simply aimed for the nearest stretch of sand. Their kayaks hit the shallow water, and they scrambled out, dragging their boats onto the beach. As they stood on the sand, catching their breath and staring out at the empty, misty bay, Edwin walked a few yards up the beach toward the tree line. Suddenly, Edwin stopped and called out to Liam, his voice trembling. Liam ran over to join him, and as he looked down at the sand, a chill ran down his spine. There, printed clearly in the wet sand, was a trail of footprints. They were bare footprints, dripping with water, leading directly out of the bay and up onto the dry beach. The water was still pooling in the deeper impressions of the toes, meaning they were incredibly fresh. Whoever made them had stepped out of the water only moments before, but the path of the footprints was what made the situation truly terrifying. The prints did not just lead up to the dry sand. They came out of the water, walked up toward the forest, and then turned to follow the shoreline directly toward the spot where Edwin and Liam had just landed. They stopped right near their kayaks, turned again, and disappeared into the dense undergrowth of the forest. Liam realized the horrifying truth. The person in the rowboat had somehow reached the shore before them, despite rowing a much heavier and slower vessel. They had landed, stepped out of the water barefoot, walked down the beach to the exact spot where the two friends would eventually land, and then retreated into the woods to watch them arrive. Edwin was terrified. He insisted that they get back into their kayaks and paddle away immediately, but Liam was possessed by a desperate need for answers. He convinced Edwin to help him follow the footprints backward along the beach, wanting to see where they had originated. They walked down the shoreline for about 2 minutes, keeping their eyes on the line of bare footprints, and then they saw it. Pulled up onto the sand at an angle, half hidden by the fog, was a small, dark wooden rowboat. The wood was weathered and black, and the heavy oars were resting quietly inside the oarlocks. It was empty. It was the exact same boat they had seen out on the water. Liam took a step toward the boat, but Edwin grabbed his arm with an iron grip. He told Liam, in no uncertain terms, that they were leaving right now. He did not care what was in the boat, and he did not care who had been rowing it. Seeing the genuine terror in his experienced friend's face finally broke through Liam's curiosity. They turned and ran back to their kayaks, shoved them into the freezing water, and paddled away from that beach as fast as their arms could carry them. When we look at these 3 cases together, we find a series of deeply unsettling commonalities. All 3 occurred along the rugged, isolated coastline of the Pacific Northwest, spanning from Northern California up to Washington State. All 3 took place in thick maritime fog that severely limited visibility and disoriented the victims. And in all 3 cases, the victims were stalked by silent, coordinated entities that seemed to anticipate their movements with impossible accuracy. This raises a terrifying question. Are these encounters the result of a highly organized, malicious group of predators who use the Region S unique weather patterns to hunt, disorient, and attack unsuspecting travelers? Let us reconstruct the first case on Highway 101. If this was a coordinated human ambush, how would it work? In many parts of the world, highway robbers and hijackers use specific, highly coordinated tactics to stop vehicles on isolated roads. The first figure Kevin saw on the shoulder was likely a lookout or a decoy. His job was simple: stand near the road, draw the driver's attention, and force them to slow down out of caution. Once Kevin passed the first lookout, a radio call or a signal could have been sent to a second accomplice further down the road. The second accomplice then took up a position on the opposite shoulder, acting as another visual distraction to keep Kevin S. focus divided and his speed low. The third accomplice was the trap. By standing directly in the center of the lane, wearing a hood to hide his identity, he forced Kevin to bring his vehicle to a complete stop. While Kevin was focused on the threat in front of him, a fourth accomplice crept up from the dense forest behind the car, intending to breach the doors or disable the vehicle. When Kevin managed to swerve around the hooded figure, the fourth accomplice, or perhaps a hidden vehicle, struck the rear of his car with a heavy specialized tool, possibly a ramming device or a weighted object, designed to disable the rear axle or force the car off the road. This would explain the massive paint-free dent on Kevin's bumper. If Kevin had not maintained control of his vehicle and accelerated away, he would have been at the mercy of a coordinated group of attackers in the middle of a desolate, cellular dead zone. Now let us examine the second case, involving the runner Marcus. If this was an attempted abduction or attack, the perpetrator had to have an intimate knowledge of the local trail. They would have known that the heavy fog would disorient Marcus, making him feel as though he had run much further than he actually had. The strange droning sound could have been a psychological tool. In military and survival contexts, low-frequency, repeating noises are often used to induce panic, disorientation, and physical exhaustion in a target. By projecting this sound from the dense brush, the stalker forced Marcus into a state of high stress running, draining his physical reserves. The 7-foot silhouette standing at the trailhead was the final, terrifying confrontation. It is possible that the attacker was using stilts or a specialized costume to appear unnaturally tall, a tactic designed to completely paralyze a victim with fear, making them easy prey. Fortunately, Marcus' instinct to run saved him from a potentially fatal encounter. Finally, we look at the third case on Willapa Bay. How could a heavy wooden rowboat possibly outpace 2 modern, high-performance kayaks? The answer lies in local knowledge. Willapa Bay is a maze of shallow channels and mudflats. An experienced local possessing a deep understanding of the bay's topography and tidal currents would know shortcuts that are completely invisible to outsiders, even those using a GPS. While Edwin and Liam were navigating the deeper, safer channels in the fog, the rower could have taken a direct, shallow route across a mudflat, easily overtaking them and reaching the beach first. the bare footprints, and the abandoned rowboat suggest a highly confident, predatory mindset. The rower did not just want to escape. They wanted Edwin and Liam to know they had been bypassed. They walked down to the exact landing spot, perhaps waiting in the tree line with a weapon, before deciding that the two men were too alert and well-equipped to attack. The legal and community aftermath of these cases remains frustratingly unresolved. Local police departments along the coast have received numerous reports over the years of strange figures, unexplained vehicle damage, and stalkers lurking in the coastal forests during heavy fog. But due to the extreme weather conditions and the remote locations, gathering physical evidence is nearly impossible. The cases are often dismissed as hallucinations, pranks, or simple accidents. But for the survivors, the psychological scars are permanent. They are left with the chilling knowledge that beneath the beautiful, serene facade of the Pacific Northwest coast, there are predators who wait for the fog to roll in, using the white darkness to hunt their prey. We must also consider the physical evidence that was left behind in each of these cases. In Kevin S. case, the damage to his vehicle was examined by a local mechanic, who confirmed that the force required to create such a massive structural dent was immense. It was not the result of backing into a wooden post or a light plastic marker at low speed. The impact had bent the steel reinforcement bar behind the plastic bumper cover. This indicates that Kevin was struck by a heavy, solid object traveling at a significant velocity. The lack of paint transfer remains one of the most baffling aspects of the investigation. It suggests that whatever struck his vehicle was either wrapped in a soft, non-marring material, like thick rubber or canvas, or was constructed from a material that does not leave behind standard automotive residue, such as weathered wood or specialized composite plastics. In the weeks following the incident, local authorities in Humboldt County received 2 other reports from drivers who experienced similar encounters on that same stretch of Highway 101. One driver reported seeing a man standing in the fog, who vanished when they approached, while another reported a heavy, unexplained impact to the side of their truck while slowing down for a patch of thick mist. Despite these reports, no suspects were ever identified. The sheer size of the Redwood National and State Parks surrounding the highway provides unlimited hiding places for anyone wishing to avoid detection, allowing them to vanish into the forest within seconds. For Marcus, the aftermath of his run was marked by a deep, lingering sense of vulnerability. He spent several days speaking with local sheriff's deputies, who conducted a thorough sweep of the wooded trail. While they did not find any giant figures or electronic equipment, they did locate several abandoned transient camps deep within the brush, well away from the designated path. In one of these camps, deputies found evidence of recent activity, including fresh food wrappers and a collection of hand tools. It was hypothesized that a squatter living in the woods may have become territorial, using the disorienting nature of the fog to terrify Marcus and drive him away from the area. However, the mystery of how anyone could have matched Marcus' running speed while producing that sustained, mechanical drone was never solved. The local high school cross-country coach, when asked about the incident, noted that even a trained athlete would find it nearly impossible to sprint through the dense, off-trail undergrowth in near-zero visibility without tripping or sustaining severe injuries. In Washington, the investigation into the mysterious rowboat on Willapa Bay yielded equally frustrating results. Edwin and Liam provided the local sheriff's department with the exact location where they had discovered the empty vessel. By the time deputies arrived at the beach the following morning, the tide had risen and swept the rowboat back out into the estuary. It was recovered several days later, drifting unmanned near the mouth of the bay. Upon inspection, the boat was found to be a custom, hand-built wooden skiff. It had no hull identification numbers, no registration decals, and no manufacturing marks of any kind. Inside the boat, investigators found only the 2 heavy wooden oars and a small length of frayed hemp rope. There were no personal items, no fishing gear, and no clues as to who owned the vessel. Local oyster farmers and commercial fishermen were questioned, but none recognized the distinctive dark craft. The footprints on the beach were long gone, washed away by the incoming tide. The sheriff's department eventually closed the file, classifying the incident as an abandoned vessel report. But for Edwin and Liam, the memory of those wet, bare footprints leading directly toward their landing spot remains a chilling reminder of how close they came to an unknown danger. They both sold their kayaks shortly after that weekend, refusing to ever return to the waters of Willapa Bay. What these stories reveal is a terrifying reality about the coastal regions of the Pacific Northwest. The geography itself, with its massive forests, labyrinthine waterways, and isolated highways, is inherently challenging. But when you introduce the element of maritime fog, the environment becomes a powerful tool for those with malicious intent. The fog does not just hide the predator, it actively disorients the prey, breaking down their situational awareness, disrupting their technology, and leaving them completely isolated in a world where help is miles away. Whether these encounters are the work of coordinated human syndicates, territorial individuals, or something even more inexplicable, they serve as a stark warning to anyone who ventures into the coastal mist. When the white darkness descends, the rules of the civilized world slip away, and you are left with nothing but your instincts to guide you back to safety. The next time you find yourself driving a dark coastal highway, running a familiar forest trail, or paddling a quiet bay, and you see the gray mist begin to roll in over the water, remember these stories. Remember that in the fog, you are never as alone as you think you are, and the shadows watching you from the mist may be closer than they appear. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.